Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive Monday edition. We're starting a little bit different today than we normally do because, well, there's some things that are a little bit different than they have been for a while, things that you care about and things we want to let you know about. Well, this all started really last Friday. We did a show in which I laid out that the Biden, NATO, and the West had basically destroyed Ukraine. And I said at the time that, yes, of course, it was Russia was the instrument that was used to physically conduct that destruction, but it was based upon the attitudes and the actions and the inactions taken by the West as a part of that. Now, I honestly didn't think, given our typical audience, that would be very surprising or that it would get a lot of controversy. But we got from an unexpected quarter, we got some pushback because of one thing that I said kind of in passing, which was, yes, of course, Russia was the one that did the invasion, and there were alternatives for them. Their hands are not clean in this as well. There were things short of war that they could have tried. But anyway, we moved on, and then I went on from that. Well, as it turned out, there was quite a lot of pushback from that. And just to kind of to let you know, we actually care a lot about the interaction we have here with our audience. We have a whole community here. One of the things it's unexpected but really cool about how this channel has formed at all is because a lot of you guys get together, and oftentimes you're having your own side chats in the chat itself during the show, which we think is really cool. And obviously you talk about things going on too, but this one got, I think without question, this was the biggest single commented upon thing by a lot of our viewers that we've had here. And I just want to read a few of them because we're going to be appreciated, answering some of these things today. One of them was, what was the alternative plan for Russia? Will you care to explain what the alternatives were, Mr. Daniel? Or Caribbean Child said, what was the other path that was open for the Russians? I'll wait, thinking that probably we're not reading these and they would be waiting a long time, but your wait is about up. A couple of others here. You keep saying Russia had other choices and never mention what those choices were. Russia was left with no choice. Bill Dawson said, what? How long did you want Russia to wait to go on with diplomacy? These keep going on. You say you've earned a rare dislike and frankly unsubscription for me for opening comments. You know darn well the United States would have destroyed Mexico or Canada if the shoe had been on the other foot. Now, I will say, by the way, I say that very oftentimes that we would absolutely have a very different view on a whole bunch of things here. And I constantly say that issue, if anybody had wanted to have a military alliance on our northern or southern border, we would take very decisive action, which we have done. So I agree with you on that part too. Astro Nerd said, you are talking nonsense. This is the only conceivable path open to Russia. And then let's see, Savage Mako 17, you are absolutely wrong about Russia having other means to solve this problem. There was no way the West was going to be placated. They've tried for years to avert this situation. And the last one, let's see, Just High Kite. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. What other paths were open? Name one. Well, as it turns out, I'm actually going to name about 10. There were many other things. And so I've just kind of said this. I guess I just sort of thought, well, some of this stuff is obvious. There's always something else you can do besides war. But since no one has ever talked about it, and I've never gone into any detail, I thought it was fair enough. The arguments and the complaints were fair, so we thought we would address them today. And yeah, even aside from the specific, questions that were there, and there was actually a lot more than that. I thought that the general audience, was needed to know what the options were. Because in my view, there are almost always alternatives, things that you can do to action short of war to benefit your side. Because we need to understand, and everybody needs to understand, that when the instrument of war is chosen, it almost always has unexpected results. It goes in directions of its own, and every single time the destruction is almost always worse than what people can think. And even people who come out on top pay an enormous price. And if you can benefit your side without having to actually go to war, then it's obviously substantially better for your country than the alternative of going to war. It should always be the last resort for a very, very good reason. And a lot of this is not anything new. It's been around for about 2,000 plus years from the famous Asian Chinese, actually, theorist Sun Tzu, who said that, listen, the practical art of war, the best thing is to take the enemy's country whole and intact. To shatter and destroy it is not so good. So it is better to recapture an army in entire than to destroy it, to capture a regiment, detachment, or company other than to destroy them. And then the key thing there in the center, you see with circled, hence to fight and conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in the breaking of the enemy's resistance without fighting. And listen, this makes sense on a very logical basis. If you can accomplish your objectives without having to go to war, then obviously that is better, because the cost to your side is huge. Now, we've talked a lot about the physical cost of Ukraine in its war since then. And they, by the way, this applies equally to the Ukraine and the Western side, because there were plenty of things we could have done short of war and didn't do any of them. But we talk about that cost a lot, but we don't talk so much about the cost that's to Russia. And even though I emphatically say, and have even in that last episode on last Friday, that the Russian side has irrevocably gained the advantage here, and the war is all but decided already. Just the final count and the final tally has yet to be talked about. But that means that the Russian side they've lost somewhere around 100,000 dead at least. Probably 250,000 men had been wounded to one degree or another. This is something that's going to take a lot of time for their country. It's been an egregious wound for many of the families, of course, permanent wounds that will never be repaired. Russia has had to spend enormous amounts of money that it could have spent on other things, that, domestically, its economy, to help its people, etc. All that had to be diverted to war-making material here. Now, there is always the valid issue that if you are pushed into a corner far enough to where it's an existential threat, then you have to act. That's the reason why we have armed forces. That's the reason why I, to this day, still advocate a strong national defense capacity for the United States, so that if we're ever attacked, we have the capacity to defend ourselves and to get rid of that threat. So it's any further threat. That's exactly what Russia's doing. It's the same thing. Every nation has that right of self-defense, and I advocate that. So I'm not a peacenik kind of anti-war, whatever. I'm anti-stupid war, but there are some times when you just can't avoid it, and war is the only alternative. The question here was the point in February 2022. Was that the last resort, or were there other options? I argue there were a number of other options that the Russian side could have done instead of the one it did choose. Now, as we've also talked about in numerous episodes here, things had been building up since, I think even in the last episode, I talked about how really that the war didn't start on February 2022, but it actually started probably in February 2014. When the issues of the Maidan affair, the negotiations with the European Union, with the Russian side, the Ukrainian side, everybody got together and they thought they had something diplomatically that could have diffused the issue and prevented war from coming out. But then they didn't take that. The Western side didn't take that, and it ended up spawning a civil war within Ukraine, especially in the east. And then that festered for all those years. So this has been building for a long time. So certainly from Russia's perspective, many people have rightly said, Putin's patience came to an end in February. And I'll say that all those things that had led up to that, really maybe the head came in December, 16th December to be specific, 2021, when Volodymyr Zelensky and Jens Stoltenberg had a press conference where they were going to address a lot of these issues that have been raised already. And the question came in, the pressure that Russia had been placing by building up a lot of forces around was to try to prevent Ukrainian accession into NATO. And so Stoltenberg went in front of everybody and said, hey, nobody tells us who joins NATO.
NATO has an open door policy, and this is enshrined in the NATO's founding treaty, Article 10 of the Washington Treaty, stating clearly that NATO can invite other European countries to join the alliance. And I was actually present at the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008 when all allies agreed that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And we stand by that decision.
Now, a week later, It's clear that Putin had been listening to that speech probably that day, and all evidence appears that that's where he said, "All right, that's it, we're done." Because it was, I think, the 22nd. So 6 days later, Putin says, "What the U.S. is doing in Ukraine is at our doorstep, and they should understand that we have nowhere further to retreat. Do they think we'll just watch idly by? If the aggressive line of our Western colleagues continues, we'll take adequate military technical response." Of course, we know what that meant. But now here's the thing: even with that rather boisterous and provocative statement by Stoltenberg there was one other thing he said in that same press conference that left the door open.
We also send a very clear message that we are ready to talk to Russia. We actually believe in dialogue. We believe that dialogue is important, especially when times are difficult as they are now. And our invitation to Moscow to meet in the NATO-Russia Council stands, and we are ready to sit down.
Now, obviously, we know for certain that Putin just said, "Yeah, forget it. We're not talking anymore. We're now going to take action," because he had been going on since 2014 in Putin's mind, trying diplomacy, trying all kinds of stuff. Of course, they tried from 2015 onward to get the Minsk Accords put into effect to no avail. It didn't work, and so that's when he concluded here. Now, many people say, yes, that's right. All that time he did everything short of war, so that's what he could have. But I will argue that there were still avenues open. And one of the key reasons I say that is because here's the truth of it. Ukraine was never coming into NATO, not because of any threats by Putin, but because NATO would not be dumb enough to actually bring Ukraine into it. Now, some of the things they had done before with the Baltics, with Poland, Bulgaria, all these countries, even, little Montenegro, which was always an eye roller in an absurd situation because they brought zero militarily. It was just for eye candy. But the issue of Ukraine was very different because it is literally on the doorstep of Russia. It is in this plains area. It's much worse militarily for Russia than even the Baltics, because where the Baltics are, they don't provide an easy land invasion route that the West could use to come into Russia. Geographically, there's a bunch of things. It's a narrow corridor, which would be very easy to defend, but for the Russia side. But Ukraine was like wide open plains and offered a number of avenues of approach on a broad front that an invading army could use. And they almost all pointed right to Moscow. So that was a very, very different situation, which the Russians had been clear, communicated all throughout, that's why it was a red line for them. But the truth is, because of the NATO's requirements to bring in new people, they didn't meet them. Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, etc., Poland, they met the conditions, which was you can't have any internal disputes, i.e. a civil war, and you can't have any active hostilities with a neighbor. All those disputes have to be resolved. And it makes sense. Why would you want to bring an alliance which is supposed to keep it strong and to defend itself, to keep it from going to war, if you're going to bring in somebody who's already got a hot war on its inside of its borders and very antagonistic relations with its neighbor on the outside? So it makes sense. So we've been talking nonsense since 2008, which Stoltenberg mentioned in that. So from 2008 to 2022, all we've been doing was talking smack. But nobody had even issued what's called a membership action plan. And that is your key issue here. That's really the line that says, okay, now they really mean it here. Now it's no longer talk, but action, because the membership action plan is a number of steps that have to be taken, but you've formally been invited. And then once these steps are completed, then you're going to be brought in. And that takes anywhere from, I think, 5 years with Bulgaria. I believe the Baltics were also about a 5-year process from the issue of the membership action plan until they were formally brought into the alliance. Poland was like 2 years because they were much further along than some of these others. But that shows you that from the issuance of the membership action plan, there's still a number of years before you can come in. And if it was, 5 years for the Baltics, it would have literally been forever for the Ukraine side, because they had so many things that would have to be done. And of course, they were one of the poorest countries in Europe and the most corrupt. Another reason why NATO wouldn't have issued a defensive alliance, because None of these other countries are going to want to put Article 5 guarantees that could draw them into a war with a nuclear powered Russia if they had somebody, an anchor like Ukraine. So they weren't going to do it. This was all talk. And until there was actually a membership action plan issued, then Russia had other things to do, because if the whole issue was no NATO on our border because we need to secure our western flank from the Russian point of view. So if there's no actual military alliance, if there's just talk but no action at all, no action towards membership, then that means there are still things you can do. There had been military exercises that were done. There was lots of people going back and forth. So there were some actions. And so it was valid for the Russians to have security concerns, which they did. But I'm going to go through just a number of the things that they could have done short of war that could have security, Russia's security concerns, their valid security concerns at a threshold below war. And again, Sun Tzu is so right, and time has always proven it correct. If you can secure your border at the lowest cost possible, then that's benefits you because all your people stay alive, and the amount of money and funds you have to expend are a lot less, and that leaves more of your money to apply to things that matter domestically, like building roads, building schools, improving the lives of your people, strengthening the economy, all of those kind of things. And so there were things that Russia could have done. Here's a few. One, based on that opening that Stoltenberg left on December 16 December 2021, they could have continued on diplomacy, and they could have been telling the Western side, no, we're deadly serious on this. We will take some action here, and they could have said, the day that you issue a membership action plan is the day we feel diplomacy has died, and there won't be any opportunities. That could have been we could have told them that, or the Russians could have told them that behind the scenes to our side, to say, hey, there is a line, here it is. You don't have to do that publicly. In fact, it's better if you don't, if you tell them privately, but if you mean what you say, that would be the trigger. So that would then give the Russians time, because they see that the European Union and the European countries and the United States were not in a hurry at all to actually issue that, because they knew it was all talk. They were talking because they knew it was poking a stick in the eye of the Russians. And the Western side loved that. They love to always poke a stick at Russia, and you love to, characterize them as this enemy that we have to defend against, because otherwise they don't have any reason to want to expand NATO. So that was one of the prime objectives of the West, was to just keep talking but never do anything towards membership for the Ukraine side. So Russia could have exploited that possibility. What they could have done, in addition to privately telling them that the membership action plan was the trigger, was to say, hey, we're not just going to put troops, move a bunch of troops to the border, which is what they've done. They did that early in 2021 after Zelensky signed that first law in March of 2021, saying that they're going to retake all of the territories that were lost, to include Crimea, by force if necessary. So what Russia put some pressure on them, put some troops on the border. They kind of took them off because things seemed to kind of calm down in that summer. Then some other things happened later in the fall, and Russia put them back up there, and they started from the fall. Then it was pretty clear that they were moving towards the potential to invade. And so they did that. But what they could have done, instead of just putting troops in there, is they could have said, all right, first of all, we're going to start building military bases around there. We're going to have a permanent military presence for it. They're not just going to move guys like they did from other parts of the Russian Federation up to there and living in tents and whatnot, because that's clearly a temporary situation. We could have, in part of the Russian negotiations could have been in their diplomacy, hey, we're very serious about this, and we're going to move permanent military bases closer to the Ukrainian border to show we are very, very serious, so that we can respond in a heartbeat. And that means you also have pre-positioned ammunition, weapons, fuel, all those kinds of things that you need to conduct and sustain combat operations. Because the closer your bases are to the line of contact, then the easier it is to get supplies through, and the smaller the logistics hurdle would turn out to be. That would have been a very, very strong signal. They could also have built up their defenses in ways that they did really in 2023. They could have built defensive lines as well. In addition to putting bases here, they could have built up a series of defensive fortifications. They could have said, look, we're interested in our flank security, our western flank security. So the Russian side could have said, we're going to physically make it really, really hard for you guys to ever do anything by building up defensive fortifications. That's another very, very strong signal that said they're very serious about this, because you're putting action behind it, not just words from the Russian side. One of the other things they could have done, and I think should have done, and I'm actually really surprised that this didn't happen. And I will tell you, I thought that the Russian army in February 2022 would have been much stronger than it was, in large part because of the 2020 Armenia-Azerbaijan War. And that was really the first time that a lot of these modern technology was used. And what you see on the screen right here, by the way, is some lessons learned. This is the U.S. Army Center for Lessons Learned. This was from August 2021 is when this was published. And what we discussed there was, it said Azerbaijan changed the dynamic by overpowering Armenian forces with the use of advanced unmanned aerial systems, everybody calls them drones now, and special operations forces to identify targets along the depth of the Armenian defense for attack by artillery, missiles, and loitering munitions. The Armenians were unprepared and unable to stop Azerbaijan forces. Full motion video in the fighting recorded methodical destruction. So basically everything that you see now in the last 3 years of war between Russia and Ukraine was basically demonstrated in this very short Nagorno-Karabakh war in the Armenia-Azerbaijan in 2020. They saw the Russian side have relations to one degree or another with both sides of that. So they had a front row seat and should have had all those lessons learned and then applied them to their army. And I really thought that the Russians would have already done that, especially with a book Doug McGregor wrote in 1997, which ironically was the first one to really talk about how all these things could seamlessly work together. And so, attacking things beyond the line of sight and using interconnected sensors, whatever, to hit targets in depth. That's exactly what he was talking about there. And we know that some of the Russians had read Doug's book because they had it translated into Russian. So what Russia could have done is to not just talk a good game, but actually modernize its forces, to recognize that, hey, this is powerful. This is decisive to the side that didn't have it, because Armenia didn't have a lot of these things. Azerbaijan did, and they just crushed them in the field because of that. That war, one of the reasons it was so short is because the Armenian side didn't have any defenses against this stuff, and they were going to lose all their armor. So they called a truce pretty quick to get that situation over with, which showed anyone who was paying attention that that's the future of warfare. So Russia should have started retooling itself. They should have started having more of these attack drones, more of the long range ones that had reconnaissance capabilities. There hadn't been any FPV drones, the ones that are so-called suicide drones. Those, I don't think they used any of those at the time. It was just like the drone would go in, spot it, then they would bring a missile in or send artillery in because they had good distance like that, or some of the drones that could launch a missile into it, etc. Russia could have modernized its forces to be able to do all that stuff, so that in the event that they had to, if Putin's red line had been crossed with the membership action plan, they could have gone into force and just been even more devastating than they might have been otherwise. So that is something that the Russians did finally belatedly do. They spent the end of 2022 all the way through the 2023 retooling their forces. And of course, now then it's a very, very powerful force that the Ukraine side simply can't match because of the scope and the scale of the Russian capacity on there and all the things that they've learned. Electronic warfare being one of the key ones that has helped to minimize the Ukraine side on the drone warfare, et cetera. All those things could have been done. They could have done some things economically. They were already in the process of working towards BRICS. They could have said, okay, we know that Americans love sanctions. Russia had already been sanctioned for quite a while, and they know just from watching that's one of the West's favorite tools, one of America's favorite tools. And so they could have said, all right, if we're going to go to war with somebody, we know we're going to get a whole lot more sanctions. So what we're going to do is we're going to start diversifying our economy, and we're going to, expand things with BRICS. We're going to try to expand more countries with BRICS. We're going to diversify our oil and gas capacity so that we have more different customers instead of the ones with the West, which were easy and very lucrative. They could have started saying, all right, we're going to start some percentages and looking maybe more to China, maybe more to India, et cetera, earlier on, before they'd even had a reason to do so militarily, because once the war started and all the sanctions went on that stopped all the Russian gas by force, just by shutting off the valves, I think 80% of the Russian gas was shut off. It's still a curious thing that during 3 years of war, for the most part, 20% of the Russian gas was still transiting Ukraine, going into the European Union. So while the Europeans are supporting war against Russia on the one hand, the two sides are benefiting from gas and they're paying each other. It was really kind of bizarre. But because of the Russians didn't do any of that before the war until after they'd gone in there, now then, because of the sanctions, now then they're in a much weaker position with both China and India. And even though they do have those new routes over, which has certainly helped, the cost has been a lot worse for Russia because the Chinese and the Indians knew that they had the leverage over them, so that they gave them a significant discount, so to, if you will be kind to that. Otherwise, you could say that they were just exploiting the Russians and saying, hey, we're going to take this gas at a whole lot lower because you don't have any. Where else are you going to send it if you don't send it to us? So Russians could have avoided some of that by having some of these deals done earlier, so that they could have been done at market prices, and then things would have been a whole lot better for them. One of the other things they could have done is something like what the United States ended up doing. They could have said, hey, okay, we have some association with Iran and with North Korea, but we don't have any kind of military alliance with them. We just have, friendship, whatever. But what we're going to start doing is what the West has done. And we're going to have these, it's called mill-to-mill relationships. And we're going to expand our military cooperation and activity with Iran and North Korea. And, that's going to move both ways. It's going to deepen our military ties. And, in the event that we should go to war with each other, we can activate those into an outright alliance, which is kind of what the U.S. had done. Some of these mill-to-mill operations preceded actually extending NATO alliance into there. So the Russians could say, hey, you do it, we'll do the same thing here too. In a similar way, what the Russia could have said was, okay, we've been saying since 2015, the Russian side has been saying since 2015, let's just apply the Minsk agreement. Let's see that the Ukraine side will amend their constitution and give these autonomy to the Donbass area, to Luhansk and Donetsk specifically, and to the Russian speakers throughout there. And then, we'll do the rest of it, which is, pull heavy weapons out and then to leave the area. That's what the Russians were doing. But what they could have done when it was clear that that wasn't going to happen, instead of going to war in February 2022, they could have started saying, okay, the West and the United States, we saw Anthony Blinken last week admit that they were giving Ukraine side a lot of support even before the weapons, before the war had broke out. President Trump, during his first administration, he did the same thing. They were giving lots of weapons and ammunition to the Ukraine side. The Russians could have said openly, not even privately, that, okay, you guys are doing that. We're going to do the same thing for the Donbass side, for the Luhansk and Donetsk militaries that are on the line of contact. We're going to openly start expanding the military capacity with them. We're going to give them training. We're going to give them ammunition. We're going to give them defensive weapons, etc. Basically, tit for tat. The Russians could have done that. They actually didn't do that to much degree at all. It was very small what they did. They could have done a lot more of that to show that don't launch a war here because it's not going to work out well. And if you do, we're prepared for it. One of the other, and really one of the, I guess, the more provocative things that the Russians could have done when it got down close to it, if all of those things failed, if there was even indications that still the Western side was getting closer to issuing a membership action plan, then Russia could have pulled out one of its bigger cards and said, hey, we're going to just cut the gas off, especially if they had spent some time fostering other customers elsewhere in China, India, and anywhere else into South America or the so-called global South. Then they could have afforded to say, we're just going to cut the gas off. Russia had already done this in 2006 and in 2009. They had used the economic terrorism was what was called by the West at the time, because they're saying, yeah, you just cut the gas off because you didn't get a good deal. And then they ended up getting a good deal and they turned the gas back on. Russia could have used that same card here for all of Europe and said all of it's going to get cut off, not just to Ukraine, but to all of Europe, because we're very serious that we're not going to allow you to do this. Had that been one of the latter stages that they've done, after they'd done all these other ones, then if sanctions were to later come on them, they would have been a lot less effective. And then Russia would have had the control over the taps. And even this 80% would still go through, because understand, The Europeans needed even that 20%. They still needed it to have to offset the loss of the 80% that was cut off in there, because it was necessary. And you see that it has significant damaging economic effects for all of Europe. So that's another thing that could have been very successful here. And then, one of the last things I guess they could also have done was to say, hey, we're going to do a full court press to try to split European unity. And we're going to offer deals to other countries in there. We're going to say, hey, look, things can benefit you a lot. BRICS is coming on. You can be in the European Union and BRICS. Turkey's doing that right now. Actually, since the war started, Turkey has applied to do that. Russia could have done that with other European nations before that to basically provide benefits for members of European Union countries and NATO countries that would make them not want to support a war, because then they would have the loss of the benefits that they started to gather from. Those were some of the many opportunities that Russia could do short of war. And Gary, if you could put that Sun Tzu image back up there, because in that last paragraph there, one of the things I really want to highlight, because I think it is so important. He says the highest form of generalship is to balk the enemy's plans. The next best is to prevent the junction of the enemy's forces. Next in order is to attack the enemy's army in the field, and the worst policy of all is to besiege walled cities. So you see, they go from the least costly thing for your side to the most costly thing for your side to try to get an outcome that you desire. And when you go this full on, if you had just said, yeah, we're going to try and get your plans thwarted, and you saw many of the things I suggested there would have potentially thwarted the Western plans at all to keep the membership action plan from ever being submitted. And then you get into some economic issues, and then you get into some other mill-to-mill kind of cooperation, whatever. So you're moving forward, but you're still short of having any of your men killed. There would be some money involved in this as you get closer to the potential for actually open conflict, because you're going to have to spend some money to build those defensive lines. You're going to have to spend some money to build your military up, to modernize it. You're going to potentially cost yourself some money if you cut the gas off, et cetera. But so far, that's financial, et cetera. It still is short of losing any manpower. And everything, then the gas can be turned back on. Military alliances can be ended at any time that doesn't work. Economic benefits can be kept open, et cetera. So those things can be action turned on and off, and there's no permanent consequences for them. But once you cross that line and you go into military operations here, then you can't come back from it until the fighting is done. And I suspect that even you see in that progression, that series of progression in the Sun Tzu part there, even after it says you can attack their army in the field, the last thing is to besiege walled cities. And that still in the modern day applies, because if Russia continues going forward, I suspect that you'll see them applying this, even though they haven't applied the rest of it very much. But I think that even though a lot of the Russians say that if no deal can be reached with the Trump administration pretty quickly, then they said they're going to continue fighting. And then that means they would take Odessa in the south, Kharkiv up in the north. And a lot of people will say, well, that would take, huge manpower. Almost, I think it's very low. I won't speak for the Russian general staff, but I suspect, based on what I've seen and the lessons that they have learned belatedly and sometimes very costly by the Russian side over 3 years, is that they would probably not try to take those cities directly on, but they would use kind of a hybrid situation. They may send partisans inside and to try to weaken the defenses from the inside, probably then cut the thing off militarily. That's one of the things they've been doing in a lot of the cities over this whole fiscal or calendar year 2024, where unlike when they went to Bakhmut and Avdiivka, where they literally just steamrolled through it and leveled the city and fought in really one of the more expensive ways. Now then they've started flanking it and surrounding, cutting off the routes of supply, and then basically giving the troops inside the choice of either staying and fighting until you're dead and you'll run out of supplies, or escape. And that's been what the Ukraine side has done. So I think you would probably see the same kind of thing there if that's a course that the Russians choose. But they have seemed to have learned a lot of these lessons now, and we don't know what Putin may be thinking if he also has come to the conclusion that there were other things he could have done. And just lastly, I'll say that there's no easy call here. In the Russian perspective, they say, hey, we were in diplomacy from February 2014 all the way through to February 2022. Our patience had run out, and so I wouldn't worry about listening to anybody talk anymore. And I'm sure from a certain point of view that's the case, but I think in retrospect you can see the cost to the Russian side, even though they are succeeding in the war, has been very high and has been permanent for huge numbers of Russian families that can never be gotten back. And I would wager that those families who have lost their sons and husbands and brothers and uncles and all that, I bet that they would say, I would prefer that we had done something short of war so that my family member would still be alive to enjoy the benefits of the diplomacy, et cetera. But that's the way, that's the path he chose. And so I don't say that anything was easy. It's real easy here from the comfort of my new studio. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but we have kind of a new studio that we're using here. It's a work in progress. We're going to keep going here, but we're trying to give you better production capabilities. But it's easy from here to say, hey, this is what Russia should have done. It was a hard call here. But I think it is very valid to say that there were legitimate alternatives to Russia choosing war at that time that could have benefited the Russian state at a lower cost. And certainly that's something I say to the United States and all, especially when we're talking about any kind of potential conflict with Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, anyone, that we need to be far more sober to recognize there are many avenues short of military force. And that includes, places like Syria and Libya and all these other kind of dumb things that we've done. We could have accomplished so much more short of war if we had used diplomacy and other means to try and accomplish, security requirements for our country. But we're terrible at it. If I'm saying that the Russians didn't do so good, believe me, I have a lot more criticisms for the way our side has done it. And so many people have been the bill payers for that. And certainly I hope that in time that everybody starts to learn this lesson, because the cost one day could just be more than anyone can pay. But be that as it may, that's our show for the day. We will be back actually today at 3 p.m. with Larry Johnson. We're expecting there's supposed to be a speech given by President Biden on some foreign policy stuff, apparently one of his last ones. And so we're hoping that happens before Larry comes on. We'll certainly talk about that. Otherwise, there's quite a few other things that we'll talk about. But as always, Larry Johnson is one of the more colorful guests that we have here. A lot of popular with a lot of our viewers here. So thanks very much. We'll see you this afternoon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.